I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the gravel crunched under my tires, each pop and crack announcing my arrival to the empty woods around me. The keys in my jacket pocket felt heavier than they should have. Just 2 pieces of metal on a simple ring, but they carried the weight of inheriting something I never expected to own. Uncle Maurice's house appeared through the trees, exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, though those memories felt hazy now. The modest 2-story structure looked smaller than it had when I was 12, its white paint more weathered, the green shutters more faded. Dense woods pressed in from all sides, creating a natural barrier that made the property feel isolated from the rest of the world. I could see why Maurice had chosen this place. He'd always preferred solitude to company, books to people. I pulled my Honda into the gravel driveway and cut the engine. The silence hit me immediately, so complete it felt almost oppressive. No traffic noise, no neighbors mowing lawns, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I sat there for a moment, staring at the front door and thinking about the conversation with Morris's lawyer 3 weeks ago. "There's just one condition," Mr. Henderson had said, adjusting his glasses as he read from Morris's will. "The basement is to remain locked and undisturbed. Under no circumstances should you enter it." I'd laughed at the time, thinking it was typical Maurice, always dramatic about something. But now, sitting in his driveway, the request felt less amusing and more puzzling. What could possibly be down there that required such a specific warning? The front door key turned easily in the lock, and I pushed the door open with a soft creak. The smell hit me first. That particular mustiness of a house that had been closed up for months. It wasn't unpleasant, just stale and heavy, like breathing through old fabric. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, listening to the way the sound echoed through the empty rooms. The living room stretched out in front of me, furnished simply with a brown couch, a coffee table stacked with geology magazines, and a brick fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Everything was exactly as Maurice had left it, down to the reading glasses folded on the side table next to his favorite chair. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and I found myself moving carefully, as if I were disturbing something sacred. I spent the next few hours unloading my car and getting a feel for the layout. The first floor was straightforward: living room, kitchen, a small bathroom, and Maurice's study. The kitchen was dated but functional, with white cabinets and a linoleum floor that had seen better decades. I noticed the basement door immediately, set into the wall next to the refrigerator, but I didn't examine it closely. Not yet. My boxes looked out of place stacked in Maurice's living room, my modern life intruding on his carefully preserved space. I'd brought the essentials, clothes, books, my laptop, enough to get by while I figured out what to do with the property. The plan was to stay for a few weeks, sort through Maurice's belongings, and decide whether to sell or keep the house. Simple enough. Or so I'd thought. The upstairs felt more personal, more lived in. Maurice's bedroom was at the front of the house, overlooking the gravel road I'd driven in on. His bed was neatly made with a faded blue comforter, and his dresser held the usual collection of everyday items: loose change, a watch, reading glasses. I opened the closet and found his clothes still hanging there, button-down shirts and slacks arranged by color. It felt wrong to touch them, so I closed the door and moved on. His study was where Morris had clearly spent most of his time. The room was packed with bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling, every inch filled with geological texts, scientific journals, and reference materials I couldn't even pronounce. His desk sat in the center of the room, covered with papers, maps, and what looked like rock samples arranged in careful rows. I picked up one of the stones, a chunk of dark granite with flecks of mica that caught the light, and turned it over in my hands. Maurice had always been passionate about geology, but this collection was more extensive than I'd realized. The maps were what really caught my attention. They covered the desk surface and spilled onto the floor, some marked with red ink in Maurice's careful handwriting. Most showed the local area with topographical details and what looked like elevation markings. I recognized the road I'd driven in on, marked clearly on several of the maps, but the red notations were in some kind of shorthand I couldn't decipher. I set the rock sample back where I'd found it and decided to leave the study for another day. Going through Maurice's research would take time, and I was already feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material he'd accumulated. Instead, I found some sheets in the linen closet and made up the bed in the spare room. I'd sleep there rather than in Maurice's bedroom. That felt too much like an intrusion. That first night passed without incident. I was exhausted from the drive and the emotional weight of being in Maurice's house, so I fell asleep quickly and slept deeply. The silence that had seemed oppressive during the day became comforting in the darkness, wrapping around the house like a blanket. The second day followed a similar pattern. I spent the morning sorting through the kitchen, checking what food Morris had left behind and making a list of things I'd need to buy in town. The afternoon was devoted to the living room, boxing up magazines and personal items that I wasn't sure what to do with yet. Everything felt normal, routine even. I was starting to think that staying here for a few weeks might actually be peaceful. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that second night that I really looked at the basement door. I'd been avoiding it, following Maurice's instructions without really thinking about it. But as I stood in the kitchen brushing my teeth, my eyes kept drifting to it. The door itself was unremarkable, white painted wood that matched the rest of the kitchen trim. But the padlock was different. It was heavy, black metal that looked much newer than anything else in the house. The hasp it was attached to was also new, the screws bright and unweathered. Maurice had clearly installed this recently, maybe in the months before he died. I finished brushing my teeth and tried to put the door out of my mind. Maurice had his reasons for the restriction, and I'd agreed to respect them. Whatever was down there could stay down there. I went upstairs to the spare room and settled into bed with a book I'd brought, some thriller novel I'd picked up at the airport weeks ago. The reading lamp cast a warm circle of light in the otherwise dark room, and I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling through the trees that surrounded the house. It was a soothing sound, natural and rhythmic. I'd been reading for maybe an hour when I heard it, a faint scratching sound so soft I almost missed it. It seemed to be coming from somewhere below me, somewhere underneath the house. I set the book down on my chest and listened, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound was delicate, almost tentative, like fingernails dragging across wood, or maybe a small animal scratching at something. I held my breath and strained to hear it better, but the moment I focused on it completely, it stopped. I waited in the silence for several minutes, my book forgotten, listening for any repeat of the sound. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the house settling. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd imagined it, or maybe heard a branch scraping against the siding outside. I picked up my book and tried to return to reading, but the words wouldn't stick in my mind. Every few minutes I found myself pausing to listen, waiting for the scratching to return. The scratching came back the next night. I was lying in the same spot, book propped against my knees, when the sound drifted up through the floorboards again. This time it was louder, more insistent. The delicate fingernail on wood quality had given way to something that sounded like deliberate scraping, as if someone was dragging something rough across a wooden surface in slow, measured strokes. I set the book aside and sat up, listening. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited, counting my breaths, and it started again. Same rhythm, same deliberate pace. My feet hit the floor before I'd really decided to get up. The hardwood was cold against my bare soles as I made my way to the bedroom door. The hallway stretched out in front of me, darker than I remembered, and I realized I'd gotten used to the reading lamp's warm glow. Out here, everything felt different, colder, more uncertain. I took the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the banister. Each step creaked under my weight, and I found myself wincing at the noise, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like I was trying to sneak up on anything. The scratching continued below, unaffected by my movement through the house. The kitchen felt cavernous in the darkness. I could make out the pale rectangles of the cabinets, the dull gleam of the refrigerator, and there in the corner, barely visible, the basement door. I moved toward it, my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest that I tried to ignore. The scratching was clearer now, definitely coming from below. I pressed my ear against the door's painted surface, feeling the cool wood against my cheek. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. Like someone was working at something down there, trying to wear it away bit by bit. I pulled back and stared at the black padlock. It looked even more substantial up close, the metal thick and unforgiving. The hasp Maurice had installed was heavy-duty too, the kind of thing you'd use to secure a storage unit or a workshop, not the kind of casual lock you'd put on a basement door just to keep it closed. The scratching stopped. I waited in the silence, ear pressed back against the door. But there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. After a few minutes, I gave up and went back upstairs, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake, listening for the sound to return. It didn't, but I lay there until dawn anyway. The third night, I was ready for it. I'd positioned myself in the spare room with the door cracked open, book in my lap, but my attention focused on the sounds of the house. When the scratching started up again around 11, I was already moving. This time, I didn't hesitate on the stairs. I went straight to the basement door and pressed my ear against it immediately. The scratching was there, just as I'd expected, but tonight it sounded different, more frantic. Instead of the measured, deliberate scraping from the previous nights, this was rapid and irregular, desperate almost. I found myself gripping the padlock, testing its weight in my palm. The metal was solid, unmoving. Whatever was down there, Maurice had made sure it would stay down there. But why? What could be in a basement that required this level of security? The scratching intensified, and I could swear I heard something else mixed in with it. A soft thumping, like something being knocked against wood. Then it all stopped at once, leaving me standing there in the dark kitchen with my hand wrapped around a padlock, feeling foolish. I told myself it had to be mice. Or rats, maybe. Something had gotten into the basement before Maurice sealed it up, and now they were trapped down there, trying to claw their way out. It made sense. It was logical. It explained everything without requiring me to consider any alternatives I wasn't ready to think about. But even as I climbed the stairs back to the spare room, I knew I didn't really believe it. Mice didn't scratch in patterns. They didn't take breaks. They didn't sound like they were working at something with tools. On the fourth night, everything changed. I woke up not to scratching, but to a voice. It was muffled, coming from below, but unmistakably human, unmistakably female, and unmistakably distressed. "Please," the voice said, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Please, somebody help me." I was out of bed and moving before the words had fully registered. My feet found the stairs in the darkness, muscle memory guiding me down to the kitchen. The voice was clearer here, filtering up through the floorboards near the basement door. "I can't. Please. I can't stay down here anymore." I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter, the one I'd been using to check the fuse box, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the basement door in harsh white light. I pressed my ear against the wood again, and the woman's voice came through more clearly. "Please," she was saying, and now I could hear the tears in her voice, the raw desperation. "Please let me out. I don't understand what you want." My hand found the padlock again, and this time I rattled it hard, testing the hasp, looking for any weakness in Morris's security measures. The metal held firm, but the rattling made enough noise that surely whoever was down there would hear it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Hello, can you hear me?" I pressed my ear back to the door, waiting for a response, but the woman's voice continued as if I hadn't spoken at all. "I won't tell anyone," she was saying. "I promise I won't tell. Just please let me go home." "I'm here," I called louder, rattling the padlock again. "I'm right here. Can you hear me?" But she wasn't talking to me. As I listened, it became clear that she was addressing someone else entirely, someone down there with her. Her voice would rise and fall, sometimes pleading, sometimes sobbing, as if she was responding to words I couldn't hear. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I did wrong." I yanked on the padlock with both hands, putting my full weight behind it, but the hasp didn't budge. The metal cut into my palms, and I could feel the beginnings of blisters forming, but I kept pulling. Somewhere below me, a woman was trapped, and I was standing here letting a piece of metal stop me from helping her. "Please," she continued, and now she was crying openly, great gasping sobs that made my chest tight. "Please. I have a family. I have children. They'll be looking for me." I rattled the door itself, pushing and pulling on the handle, checking the hinges, looking for any way to get it open. The door was solid, well built, and Maurice had done his work thoroughly. Without bolt cutters or a hacksaw, I wasn't getting through that padlock. "I'm going to get you out," I called through the door, not caring anymore whether she could hear me. "I'm going to find a way." Her voice shifted then, became smaller, more frightened. "No," she whispered. "No, please don't. I'll be quiet. I'll be good. Please don't hurt me anymore." The pleading continued through the night, sometimes rising to desperate cries, sometimes falling to barely audible whispers. She begged for freedom, for mercy, for someone to tell her family where she was. She promised to be quiet, to cooperate, to never speak of what had happened to her. And through it all, she never once responded to my calls, never acknowledged that someone was trying to help her from the other side of the door. I needed tools. The woman's voice had grown weaker through the night, her pleas more broken, and I couldn't spend another moment listening to someone trapped while I stood helpless on the other side of a locked door. The drive into town took 20 minutes through winding roads that cut between thick stands of pine and oak. I'd passed Carter's Hardware twice since arriving at Maurice's house, but this was my first time actually stopping. The building sat on Main Street between a diner and a small insurance office, its red brick facade weathered but solid. A hand-painted sign hung above the entrance, the letters slightly faded but still readable. The bell above the door chimed when I stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Motor oil, fertilizer, and the metallic scent of new tools. Narrow aisles stretched back toward a counter where an older man with graying hair looked up from a clipboard. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked by years of physical work. "Morning," he said, setting the clipboard aside. "You must be Morris's nephew. I'm Phoenix Carter." "Dakota," I said, walking toward the counter. "I need some bolt cutters." Phoenix nodded and gestured toward the back wall. "Got several sizes back there. What are you cutting through?" "Just a padlock," I said, following him down an aisle lined with hand tools. He stopped in front of a display rack holding various cutting tools. "These 18-inch ones should handle most standard locks," he said, lifting a pair with red handles. "Unless you're dealing with something heavy-duty, then you'd want these 36-inch ones." I examined the larger cutters. They looked serious, built for cutting through substantial metal. "I'll take the big ones." Phoenix pulled them from the rack and we walked back toward the counter. "So, what are your plans for Maurice's place?" thinking about staying long-term or just getting it ready to sell. Not sure yet, I said, watching him ring up the purchase. Still figuring things out. He nodded, entering numbers into an old cash register. Maurice was a good customer. Came in here pretty regular, especially these last few years, always buying heavy-duty locks, reinforcement hardware, that kind of thing. I handed him my credit card, trying to keep my expression neutral. Heavy-duty locks? Yeah, real serious stuff. Industrial-grade padlocks, heavy hasps, security hardware. More than most folks around here would need. Phoenix ran my card and handed it back. Course, living out there in the woods, I guess a man wants to feel secure. The receipt printed with a mechanical whir. Phoenix tore it off and slid it across the counter along with the bolt cutters. These should handle whatever you're dealing with. Thanks, I said, picking up the tools. You need anything else while you're getting settled? Just let me know. I knew Maurice for 15 years, and I'm always happy to help family. I thanked him again and left, the bolt cutters heavy in my hands as I walked back to my car. Phoenix's comment about Maurice buying heavy-duty locks stuck with me during the drive home. It wasn't just the basement door. Maurice had been securing other things too. But what? The afternoon passed slowly. I tried to focus on sorting through more of Maurice's belongings, but my attention kept drifting to the basement door and the bolt cutters sitting on the kitchen counter. I organized books in his study, packed more clothes from his bedroom, and attempted to make sense of the geological maps spread across his desk. The red markings still meant nothing to me, but I noticed they seemed to cluster around specific areas, with some locations circled multiple times. Evening came too soon. I made a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, acutely aware of the locked door just a few feet away. The bolt cutters sat beside my plate like an accusation, their metal surfaces reflecting the overhead light. As darkness settled over the house, I found myself checking the time every few minutes. 9 o'clock passed, then 10. I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap, but the words might as well have been in another language. My ears strained for any sound from below, dreading what I knew was coming. At 10:43, I heard the first scrape. This time, though, it wasn't just the woman's voice or the scratching I'd grown accustomed to. Multiple sounds drifted up through the floorboards, heavy objects being dragged across concrete, the screech of metal against stone. And underneath it all, a low rumble of voices. Not just one voice, but several, speaking in tones too muffled to make out words. I closed the book and stood up, my hands trembling slightly. The sounds grew louder as I moved toward the kitchen, and with them came something that made my skin crawl: laughter. Not the kind of laughter you'd hear at a party or watching a funny movie, but something twisted and wrong, like people enjoying something they shouldn't. The woman's voice cut through everything else, clearer now and more desperate than I'd ever heard it. Please, I have children. They need me. Please just let me go home. Her words hit me like physical blows. Children. She had children waiting for her somewhere, wondering where their mother was while she remained trapped in my uncle's basement. I'll do whatever you want, she continued, her voice breaking. Just please don't hurt me anymore. I won't tell anyone, I promise. No one has to know. The scraping sounds intensified, as if heavy furniture was being moved around below. The other voices grew louder too, though I still couldn't make out individual words. But their tone was clear enough. They were enjoying this. I grabbed the bolt cutters from the counter, their weight solid and reassuring in my hands. Whatever Maurice's reasons for locking that door, whatever he'd been trying to keep hidden, I couldn't let it continue. Not when someone was suffering down there. The padlock felt different under the bolt cutter's jaws than it had when I'd pulled at it with my bare hands. The metal was thick, but the cutters were designed for exactly this purpose. I positioned the blades carefully, making sure I had a good grip, then squeezed with everything I had. The metal resisted at first, then gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet kitchen. The padlock fell to the floor with a heavy clunk, and suddenly the basement door was just a door. No longer the impenetrable barrier it had been for days. I reached for the handle, then stopped. The sounds from below had gone completely silent the moment the padlock broke. No more scraping, no more voices, no more laughter. Even the woman had stopped speaking. The silence felt heavier than the sounds had been. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. A rush of cold, stale air hit my face immediately, carrying with it the smell of dampness and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant that made me want to step back. I clicked on the flashlight and aimed the beam down into the darkness. Wooden stairs descended into the basement, their edges worn smooth by years of use. The light revealed about 8 steps before disappearing into the black space below. "Hello?" I called down. "Can you hear me? I'm here to help." The woman's voice came back immediately, much clearer now without the door between us. "Help me, please, I can't get out. I've been trying, but I can't get out." Her words echoed up from the darkness, bouncing off concrete walls I couldn't see. She sounded closer than before, as if she was right at the bottom of the stairs waiting for me. I gripped the flashlight tighter and put one foot on the first step. The wood creaked under my weight, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. I descended slowly, keeping the light trained ahead of me, each step revealing a little more of the basement below. The concrete walls came into view first, gray and slightly damp, with dark stains that could have been water damage or something else entirely. An old furnace squatted in one corner, its metal surface covered in rust and dust. Pipes ran along the ceiling, and I could see the outline of what looked like a workbench against the far wall. It looked like a typical basement. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the sounds I'd been hearing or require the kind of security Maurice had installed. I descended the remaining steps, the flashlight beam sweeping across the concrete floor. The basement stretched out in front of me, larger than I'd expected from upstairs. My shoes made soft, scraping sounds against the rough concrete as I moved forward, the beam revealing storage shelves lined with old paint cans and gardening supplies along one wall. But something was wrong with the center of the room, where there should have been solid concrete floor. A massive hole gaped open like a wound in the earth. The opening stretched roughly 8 feet across, its edges jagged and uneven in a way that made my stomach clench. I moved closer, holding the flashlight higher, and saw that the concrete hadn't been broken by tools or machinery. The edges looked torn, clawed apart by something with incredible strength. Chunks of concrete and rebar jutted out at odd angles, and the metal reinforcement bars were twisted and bent as if they'd been pulled apart by hand. The woman's voice drifted up from the darkness below, clearer now that I was closer. "Please, someone help me. I've been down here so long." Other sounds rose with her voice. Whispers that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Soft laughter that echoed strangely in the confined space. The shuffle and scrape of movement, like dozens of people shifting around in the darkness below, though I couldn't see how that was possible in what should have been solid earth beneath Maurice's house. I approached the edge carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight down. The concrete near the hole looked stable enough, but the sight of those clawed edges made me cautious. When I reached the rim, I knelt down and aimed the flashlight beam directly into the opening. The light disappeared into blackness. I had a powerful LED flashlight, one that could illuminate objects 100 yards away, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by whatever lay below. It was like looking into a well with no bottom, except this hole couldn't exist. Maurice's basement sat on bedrock, according to the geological surveys I'd seen scattered across his desk upstairs. "Hello," I called down. "Can you hear me up here? How did you get down there?" The instant my voice echoed into the hole, every sound stopped. The whispers cut off mid-syllable. The shuffling movement ceased completely. Even the woman's voice went silent, as if my words had startled everyone below into sudden stillness. I waited, listening to my own breathing and the distant hum of the old furnace. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, the laughter resumed. But it sounded different now. Before, the laughter had been mixed in with other sounds, part of the general noise rising from below. Now it was focused, deliberate. There was a mocking quality to it that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the kind of laughter you heard from people having a good time. It was predatory, like something that had just spotted prey. The woman's voice started again too, but the desperate edge was gone. "Come down and help me," she called, and her tone was almost cheerful now. "It's not that far. You can make it down here easily." I backed away from the edge, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. The woman had been pleading for help just moments ago, terrified and desperate. Now she sounded calm, inviting, like she was asking me to join her for coffee, instead of climbing down into an impossible hole in my uncle's basement. "I can't see the bottom," I called down, trying to keep my voice steady. "How deep is it down there?" "Oh, it's not deep at all," she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Just a little drop. Come on down. I really need your help." Other voices joined hers, and that's when my blood went cold. What had sounded like whispers and background noise before resolved into distinct voices, dozens of them, maybe more. They overlapped and intertwined, some speaking in what sounded like English, while others used languages I didn't recognize at all. The foreign words had harsh consonants and rolling vowels that seemed to twist around each other in ways that hurt to listen to. But mixed in with the unknown languages, I heard something that made me stumble backward until my shoulders hit the basement wall. "Dakota," one of the voices called softly. "Dakota Perry." Another voice picked it up. "Dakota! Come down, Dakota!" Soon they were all saying it, a chorus of voices chanting my name in different tones and inflections. Some whispered it like a secret, others sang it like a lullaby. A few spoke it with the kind of familiarity you'd use with an old friend. I had never told them my name. I had never told anyone down there anything about myself. I'd only just arrived at Maurice's house a few days ago, and I'd been alone since I got here. The woman had been calling for help, not asking questions about who I was. The voices continued their chorus, my name echoing up from the impossible hole in overlapping waves. Some of the voices sounded young, like children. Others were elderly, cracked with age. There were men and women, teenagers and adults, all repeating Dakota over and over in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. I pressed myself against the basement wall, the concrete cold and rough against my back through my shirt. The flashlight shook in my hand, its beam dancing across the ceiling as I tried to process what I was hearing. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Holes didn't just appear in basement floors, especially not holes that seemed to have no bottom. And voices didn't know your name unless someone told them. The woman's voice rose above the others, still maintaining that cheerful, inviting tone. "Don't be afraid, Dakota. We've been waiting for you. Maurice told us you'd come eventually." My uncle's name hit me like a physical blow. Maurice had been dead for over a month. The funeral was 6 weeks ago. I'd been there, seen the casket, watched them lower it into the ground. But somehow these voices knew him, knew he'd had a nephew named Dakota who would inherit the house. The chanting of my name grew louder, more insistent. Voices called up from the darkness, some pleading, others commanding, all of them somehow knowing exactly who I was. The foreign languages mixed with English now, but even the words I couldn't understand seemed to carry my name embedded within them, twisted into syllables that shouldn't have been able to form the sounds, but did anyway. I backed away from the hole and bolted up the basement stairs, taking them 2 at a time. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, nearly dropping it twice before managing to unlock the screen. The contact list blurred as I scrolled to find the emergency number. my finger hovering over the keypad for a second before I dialed 911. 911? What's your emergency? I need police at 17 Oak Ridge Road, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There's someone trapped in my basement. Multiple people, actually. I can hear them calling for help. Sir, are you saying there are people trapped in your basement right now? Yes, there's a hole in the floor, and they're down there. I don't know how deep it goes or how they got there, but they need help. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line while she sent units to my location. I paced the kitchen, occasionally glancing at the open basement door. The voices had stopped again, but I knew they were still down there. They had to be. 20 minutes later, I heard car doors slamming outside. Blue and red lights flashed through the living room windows as I opened the front door. 2 officers approached the house. A woman in her 30s with black hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a taller man with red hair and the build of someone who'd been doing this job for years. Mr. Perry, I'm Officer Peters. This is Detective West. You called about people trapped in your basement? Yes, they're down there. I heard them calling for help, and there's this massive hole in the concrete floor. I don't understand how it's possible, but it's there. Officer Peters pulled out a notepad. How many people did you hear? I'm not sure. At least one woman, but there were other voices too. Different ages, different languages. The woman said she had children, that she wanted to go home. Detective West adjusted his jacket, and I caught sight of his shoulder holster. When did you first notice these voices? A few nights ago. It started with scratching sounds, then last night I heard the woman clearly. Tonight I finally got the basement door open and went down to help. The door was locked? Officer Peters asked. My Uncle Maurice left it padlocked. Heavy-duty lock, industrial strength. I had to cut it off with bolt cutters. I led them through the kitchen, pointing at the broken padlock on the floor near the basement door. Detective West picked it up, examining the cut metal. This is serious hardware. Why would your uncle lock the basement like this? I don't know. His will said never to open it, but when I heard people trapped down there, I couldn't just leave them. Officer Peters clicked on her flashlight. We'll take a look. Stay up here while we check it out. I watched them descend the wooden stairs, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness below. My heart hammered as I waited for them to see what I'd seen, to hear the voices, to understand that something impossible was happening in Maurice's basement. Mr. Perry, can you come down here, please? I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen counter and followed them down the stairs. Officer Peters stood near the furnace, sweeping her light across the walls. Detective West was examining the floor in the center of the basement. The concrete was solid, completely, impossibly solid. Where the 8-foot hole had been, where I'd stared down into bottomless darkness just an hour ago, there was nothing but smooth, gray concrete. No jagged edges, no torn rebar, no opening at all. Just ordinary basement flooring that looked like it had been there for decades. I don't understand. I walked to where the hole had been, kneeling down to touch the concrete. It was cold and solid under my palm. It was right here, 8 feet across, maybe more. The edges were all torn up, like something had clawed through from underneath. Officer Peters crouched beside me. You're sure you saw a hole here? Yes, I'm certain. I shined my flashlight down into it, called to the woman. She answered me. They all did. I looked up at both officers, seeing the expression I'd been dreading, professional concern mixed with skepticism. Detective West ran his flashlight along the concrete in a grid pattern. Mr. Perry, this floor doesn't show any signs of recent digging or construction. The concrete looks original to the house. See how it's settled and aged? This has been here for years. But I heard them. The voices, the scratching, the woman begging for help. When's the last time you got a full night's sleep? Officer Peters asked gently. I don't know. A few days, maybe. But this isn't about being tired. I know what I saw. Detective West stood up, brushing dust off his hands. Grief and stress can affect people in different ways. Moving into a deceased relative's house, being alone out here in the woods, it's not uncommon for people to experience auditory hallucinations. This wasn't a hallucination. Officer Peters checked the basement walls, examining the storage shelves and old paint cans. Everything looked exactly as I'd seen it before, except for the missing hole that had dominated the center of the room. "We're not finding any evidence of people being trapped down here," she said. "No signs of disturbance, no indication anyone's been held against their will." They spent another 10 minutes examining every corner of the basement. Detective West tested the walls for hollow spaces, while Officer Peters photographed the concrete floor. I stood there watching them work, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. When we went back upstairs, Officer Peters filled out her report at the kitchen table, while Detective West asked me more questions about my uncle, the house, and my mental state over the past few days. "Has anyone else been in the house with you? Family members? Friends?" "No, just me." "Any history of mental health issues? Depression? Anxiety? Anything like that?" "No, nothing like that. I'm not crazy." "Nobody's saying you're crazy," Officer Peters said, closing her notepad. "But you've been under a lot of stress. Inheriting property, moving, dealing with your uncle's death. Sometimes our minds process trauma in unexpected ways." They left their cards on the kitchen counter and told me to call if I experienced anything else unusual. I watched their patrol car disappear down the gravel road, red taillights fading between the trees. Back in the kitchen, I sat at the table staring at the basement door. The broken padlock still lay on the floor where I'd dropped it. The bolt cutters rested against the counter where I'd left them. Physical evidence that I'd cut through Maurice's security measures, that I'd gone downstairs, that something had happened. But the hole was gone. The voices were silent. Everything I'd experienced had vanished like it never existed. I picked up one of the business cards Officer Peters had left behind, turning it over in my hands. Maybe they were right. Maybe grief and isolation were affecting my judgment. Maybe the scratching sounds were just mice in the walls and my exhausted brain had manufactured the rest. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Wind moved through the trees outside, rustling leaves against the windows. Normal sounds from a normal house in normal woods, I almost convinced myself. Then, as darkness settled fully over the property, I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A soft scraping sound from below the kitchen floor. Not the frantic clawing from before, not the desperate scratching of previous nights. Something quieter, more careful, like fingernails tracing patterns on concrete. I sat perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic. Then, so soft I almost missed it, a woman's voice drifted up through the floorboards. "Dakota." Just my name, spoken like a whisper, but clear enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. The voices were still there, still calling from whatever impossible space existed beneath Maurice's basement floor. I hadn't lost my mind. I woke to pale morning light filtering through the spare room curtains. My neck ached from sleeping upright in the chair, still dressed in yesterday's clothes. The house felt different in daylight, quieter, more ordinary. For a moment, I almost convinced myself the previous night had been some kind of stress-induced breakdown. Then I remembered Officer Peters' business card on the kitchen table and the broken padlock still lying on the floor. I made my way downstairs, each step reminding me of how real everything had been. The basement door stood open exactly as I'd left it, bolt cutters propped against the counter like evidence of my desperation. I approached the doorway cautiously and peered down the wooden steps. Normal basement, concrete floor, no hole. But I knew what I'd seen. I was filling the coffee maker when I noticed something white against the dark wood of the front door. A piece of paper, folded and pressed against the bottom edge where someone had slipped it underneath. I set down the coffee pot and walked over, bending to pick it up. My name was written across the front in careful, slanted handwriting I recognized immediately. Maurice's script, the same precise lettering I'd seen on notes throughout his study and marked across his geological maps. The ink looked fresh, black and clear against the cream-colored paper. My hands started shaking before my brain caught up. Maurice had been dead for 3 months. The funeral had been in September. Closed casket because of how long it took to find his body after the hiking accident. I'd stood there with a handful of his geology colleagues and the lawyer, watching them lower an empty shell into the ground. I turned the envelope over. No postmark, no stamp. Just my name in Maurice's unmistakable handwriting. The paper felt normal between my fingers, regular weight, slightly textured. Not some supernatural manifestation, just an ordinary envelope that someone had slipped under my door sometime between last night and this morning. Someone who wrote exactly like my dead uncle. I carried it back to the kitchen table and sat down, staring at my name written in that familiar script. Maurice had always been precise with his handwriting, the kind of careful formation that came from years of taking field notes and recording measurements. Every letter was exactly as I remembered. The envelope wasn't sealed. I lifted the flap and pulled out 2 sheets of the same cream paper, covered front and back with Morris's careful writing. At the top of the first page, he'd written a date. October 15th, the day before his body was found on that hiking trail. Dakota. If you're reading this, then you've opened the basement door despite my instructions. I don't blame you. The sounds would have driven me to the same choice, and I always knew the lock was only a temporary solution. I set the letter down and looked around the kitchen. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it. Coffee maker half filled, broken padlock on the floor, bolt cutters against the counter. But someone had been here. Someone had walked up to my front door in the dark and slipped this envelope underneath. I picked up the letter again. I should have destroyed the house years ago, but I was too much of a coward. I told myself I was protecting people by keeping it locked away, but really, I was protecting myself from having to face what I'd done, what I'd awakened. The house sits on top of something that was here long before Millbrook was founded, long before any of us understood what we were building over. I found it by accident in 1998 when I first bought the property. There were sounds, just like you've been hearing. Scratching at first, then voices, a woman calling for help. My coffee maker finished brewing with a soft beep, but I didn't move. Morris's words continued in that same careful script. I researched everything I could find about the land's history. The original surveys from 1867 mentioned unusual geological formations in this area, deep caverns and underground spaces that the surveyors couldn't adequately map. The local Abenaki tribes had stories about this place, warnings about voices that called from beneath the earth. They avoided building here, avoided even hunting here. But we didn't listen to those stories. We never do. I flipped to the second page, Maurice's handwriting continuing without a break. The entity feeds on curiosity and fear. It uses whatever sounds will draw people closer. Voices, scratching, movement. It learns what will work on each person and adapts its approach accordingly. The whole appears when it wants to be found and becomes invisible when it doesn't want to be seen. That's why the police found solid concrete. It knew they would interfere with its plans. But once you've seen it, once you've acknowledged its presence, it knows you're there. It has your scent, your attention. The sounds will continue, and they'll get stronger, more convincing, more desperate. My mouth felt dry. I could hear the coffee maker's warming plate clicking on and off, the only sound in the morning stillness. I made the terrible mistake of going down there once, Dakota, in 2003, after 5 years of hearing the voices every night. I thought I could help whoever was trapped. I thought I could be the hero. What I found down there still visits my dreams, still wakes me up screaming sometimes. The voices aren't people, Dakota. They're echoes, impressions left behind by everyone who came before us, everyone who heard the calls and answered them. The entity collects them somehow, uses their voices to call to the next person. I saw them down there in the darkness, dozens of people from different time periods, all perfectly preserved in whatever state they were in when they fell. Some recent, some wearing clothes from decades ago. All of them aware, all of them trying to warn me to run, while the thing that had them made them call out in welcoming voices. I had to stop reading for a moment. The kitchen felt too quiet, too still. I got up and checked the front door lock, then the back door, then returned to the table. I managed to get back up the stairs, but it followed me part way. I could feel it testing the boundaries, pressing against whatever force keeps it contained below ground. That's when I installed the first lock, then stronger locks, then the industrial-grade security system. For 20 years, I've been researching ways to destroy it or seal it permanently. I've contacted experts in folklore, geology, even paranormal investigation. Nothing worked. The entity is too old, too established. It's part of the land itself now. I know this letter won't stop you from investigating further. The sounds will continue, and eventually they'll wear down your resistance just like they wore down mine. But I wanted you to understand what you're dealing with before you make any decisions. The house should be burned to the ground, Dakota. The whole property should be salted and abandoned. But I know you won't do that based on a letter from your dead uncle. You'll need to see for yourself, just like I did. When that time comes, remember what I've told you. The voices aren't real people who need saving. They're bait. And once you go down there, you become part of the collection. I'm sorry I left this burden for you. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to end it myself. Maurice. I read through the letter twice more, Maurice's careful handwriting becoming more familiar with each pass. Every word was in his voice, his precise way of explaining complex ideas, the geological references, the methodical approach to research, even the self-deprecating tone when he called himself a coward. It all sounded exactly like the uncle I remembered. But Maurice was dead. I'd seen the death certificate, signed the paperwork with the lawyer. Heart failure on a hiking trail, his body found 3 days later by a search team. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Someone wanted me to believe Maurice had written this the day before he died. Someone who knew his handwriting well enough to forge it perfectly, who understood his personality and speaking patterns, who was familiar enough with his research to reference specific dates and historical details. The basement door remained open across the kitchen, morning light from the windows not quite reaching the top step. Everything down there had looked completely normal when the police investigated. Solid concrete floor, old storage shelves. Nothing unusual, but I'd seen that hole. I'd heard those voices calling my name. I set the envelope on the kitchen table next to Officer Peter's business card. 2 different explanations for what was happening to me. The police thought I was experiencing grief-induced hallucinations. This letter suggested something far worse was lurking beneath Maurice's house, something that had been calling to people for over a century. Neither explanation made me feel any better about spending another night here. I spread the letter flat on the kitchen table, smoothing the creases with my palms. Maurice's handwriting looked up at me. Each letter formed with that careful precision I remembered from birthday cards when I was a kid. The paper felt real enough under my fingers, but the date at the top made my stomach twist. October 15th, the day before they found his body on that hiking trail. I read through it again, slower this time, letting each word register. Maurice described the hole as something that didn't lead to a basement or cave, but to somewhere that exists outside normal reality. The phrase made me pause. Outside normal reality. What did that even mean? But as I kept reading, his explanation became clearer and more terrifying. The voices weren't from trapped people at all. They were from those who were taken, now serving as bait for the next victim. My hands started shaking again as I processed what Maurice was telling me. Every desperate plea I'd heard, every woman crying for her children, every voice begging for help. None of them were real in the way I understood real. They were echoes, impressions, collected pieces of people who had fallen into whatever waited below, and now they were being used to draw me down the same path. I set the letter down and walked to the basement door. It stood open exactly as I'd left it after the police visit, the wooden steps disappearing into darkness below. The concrete floor looked solid from up here, just like the officers had found it. But I knew what I'd seen. That massive hole, those jagged edges, the way my flashlight beam had vanished into nothing. Returning to the table, I picked up the letter and continued reading Maurice's urgent advice. "Leave immediately," he wrote. "Never try to help the voices or investigate further." The words were underlined twice, his pen pressing hard enough to indent the paper. "And whatever you do, never go down into that hole. The entity grows stronger with each person who acknowledges it." The letter went on to explain that Morris had spent years trying to find a solution, consulting experts, researching the land's history, looking for some way to permanently seal or destroy whatever lived beneath the house. Nothing had worked. The thing was too old, too established, too much a part of the land itself. His final recommendation was stark. Sell the house, but make sure any new owners understand the danger. I folded the letter and set it aside, then got up to pour myself coffee. The normal action felt strange after reading Morris's warnings about reality-bending entities and collected souls. Steam rose from the mug as I added sugar, the spoon clinking against ceramic in a sound that seemed too ordinary for what I was dealing with. As if the thing below could sense my thoughts, a new sound drifted up from the basement. Not the careful scratching I'd grown used to, but voices, multiple voices calling my name with renewed energy and purpose. They were louder than before, more insistent, as though reading Maurice's letter had somehow strengthened their ability to reach me. "Dakota," came a woman's voice, the same one I'd first heard. But now I knew what Maurice had told me. She wasn't a trapped person needing rescue. She was bait, a lure designed to draw me closer to whatever waited in that impossible space below. "Please, Dakota," called another voice, this one younger, maybe a teenager. "We've been waiting for you. We can explain everything if you just come down." More voices joined in, creating a chorus that rose through the floorboards with increasing volume. Some spoke in English, others in languages I couldn't identify. But they all knew my name. All directed their pleas specifically at me. Children's voices mixed with elderly ones, men and women of various ages, all promising answers to questions I hadn't even asked. "Your uncle told us about you," said a man's voice with a slight accent I couldn't place. "He said you'd understand. He said you'd want to know the truth." I gripped my coffee mug tighter, feeling the heat through the ceramic. Maurice had warned me about this exactly, how the entity would use whatever approach seemed most likely to work. Now it was offering knowledge, playing on curiosity instead of compassion. It knew I'd read the letter. It knew I understood the voices weren't real trapped people. So it was adapting, offering something else to tempt me down those stairs. "We can show you things," whispered a child's voice. "Amazing things, beautiful things. Your uncle saw them before he left." The voices continued for another hour, overlapping and interweaving, sometimes speaking individually, sometimes chanting my name in unison. I sat at the kitchen table with Maurice's letter, listening to the impossible chorus and understanding that every word was calculated to pull me toward that hole. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. The voices had grown so loud I could hear them clearly even when I went upstairs to the spare room. They followed me through the house, seeping up through floorboards and echoing in the walls themselves. Every few minutes, a new voice would join the chorus, each one claiming to have answers, promising revelations, insisting that just a quick look wouldn't hurt anyone. I pulled my suitcase from under the bed and started throwing clothes into it. T-shirts, jeans, the few button-downs I'd brought, everything went in without folding. My hands moved automatically while my mind raced through Maurice's warnings. The entity grows stronger with each person who acknowledges it. I'd already acknowledged it. I'd already listened, responded, tried to help. How much stronger had I made it just by being here? Downstairs, I grabbed my toiletries from the bathroom and swept Maurice's geological books from the study into a cardboard box. I wasn't sure why I was taking them, but they felt important somehow. Evidence, maybe. Or just something concrete to hold on to when the rest of this felt like madness. The voices grew more frantic as I packed. They could sense what I was doing, and their tone shifted from welcoming to desperate. "Don't leave us, Dakota," pleaded the woman who'd started it all. "We need you. We've been alone so long. Your uncle promised you'd help," called the teenager's voice, now with an edge of accusation. "He said you were different. He said you cared about people." I carried my bags to the car, making multiple trips while the voices continued their assault. They were so loud now that I wondered if the neighbors could hear them, then remembered there were no neighbors. Maurice had chosen this isolated spot deliberately, keeping the thing contained where it couldn't reach anyone else. Loading the trunk, I found myself moving faster with each trip. The voices weren't just coming from the basement anymore. They seemed to follow me outside, clinging to the edges of my hearing even in the open air. That shouldn't be possible according to Maurice's letter. He'd said the entity was bound to the space below ground, but maybe 20 years of feeding had changed things. Maybe it was getting stronger. "You can't leave," said a man's voice, older and more authoritative than the others. "You're part of this now. You opened the door. You listened to us. You belong here." I slammed the trunk shut and headed back for one final load. In the kitchen, I grabbed Maurice's letter from the table and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. The voices were so loud now they seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, even the air itself. A cacophony of pleading, promising, threatening, all centered on keeping me in this house. As I reached for my keys on the counter, something made me look toward the basement door one last time. The wooden steps descended into darkness, looking perfectly normal and innocent, but I could hear them down there. Dozens of voices calling my name, begging me not to abandon them, promising me answers to every question I'd ever had. For just a moment, I felt the pull Maurice had described. The desperate need to know, to understand, to help. These voices sounded so real, so human, so genuinely in need. What if Maurice had been wrong? What if there really were people trapped down there, and I was abandoning them based on the ravings of a man who died alone on a hiking trail? But then I remembered the hole that appeared and disappeared. The way my flashlight beam had vanished into nothing. The impossible knowledge of my name. Maurice hadn't been crazy. He'd been trying to warn me. I walked to the front door without looking back at the basement. Behind me, the voices rose to a crescendo, calling my name over and over, promising everything I could ever want if I'd just turn around, just take one more look, just come down for a moment to see what they had to show me. I stepped outside and pulled the door shut, then turned the key in the lock with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped it. The voices continued even through the closed door, muffled but still audible, still calling my name with desperate insistence. Walking to my car, I could hear them growing fainter with each step. By the time I reached the driver's side door, they were barely whispers. I got in, started the engine, and put the car in reverse. As I backed down the gravel driveway, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching Maurice's house grow smaller behind me. I didn't look back at the building itself. I couldn't risk seeing something in those windows, some face or figure that might make me stop the car and reconsider. The Honda's tires crunched over gravel as I reached the main road and shifted into drive. I pressed the accelerator and headed toward town, leaving the house and its impossible basement and its chorus of collected voices behind me. In my rearview mirror, the trees closed over the driveway, hiding the white house with green shutters from view. I never went back to the house. The decision wasn't gradual or something I wrestled with over weeks of careful consideration. I made it in the car, driving away from Oak Ridge Road with Morris's letter in my jacket pocket and the sound of those voices still ringing in my ears. By the time I reached the main highway, I knew I was done with that place forever. I spent the first night in a motel outside Millbrook, lying awake on scratchy sheets and listening for sounds that never came. The silence felt strange after days of constant scratching and voices, but I welcomed it. In the morning, I drove straight to the city without stopping for breakfast or coffee, putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was waiting in that basement. Finding an apartment took 3 days of searching through rental listings and meeting with landlords who asked too many questions about my previous address. I settled on a 1-bedroom place on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse in the downtown district. The building had thick concrete walls and neighbors on all sides, the kind of place where human noise would drown out anything else trying to get my attention. The rent was higher than I wanted to pay, but the security deposit came from my savings account without much damage. I signed the lease using my city address and never mentioned the inherited house to anyone. Moving my belongings from the motel to the apartment took one trip in the Honda. I hadn't accumulated much during my brief stay at Maurice's place, just the clothes I'd packed and the box of geological books from his study. Everything else remained in that house, abandoned along with whatever was calling from beneath the basement floor. I told myself I didn't need any of it, that starting fresh meant leaving everything behind. The apartment came furnished with basic pieces that suited me fine. I arranged Maurice's books on the built-in shelves and tried to create something resembling a normal living space. The geological texts looked out of place among the generic furniture, but I kept them anyway. They were the only physical reminder of Maurice himself, separate from the house and its secrets. Getting rid of the property proved more complicated than I'd expected. Real estate law required disclosure of known issues, and I spent hours researching what qualified as material facts that buyers needed to know. I couldn't exactly list "basement contains portal to supernatural entity" on the disclosure forms, but I had Maurice's letter documenting the problem in his own words. I contacted 3 different real estate agents before finding one willing to handle what he called a challenging property situation. James Morrison specialized in estate sales and difficult transactions, the kind of agent who dealt with everything from flood damage to family disputes. When I explained that the previous owner had left warnings about the basement and I wanted to include those documents with any sale, he didn't ask for details beyond what was legally necessary. The first potential buyer was a young couple looking for a fixer-upper they could renovate on weekends. They toured the house with James while I waited in the city, checking my phone every hour for updates. James called that evening to report they'd withdrawn their offer after reading Morris's letter. He didn't elaborate on their reaction, just said they'd decided to look for something that didn't require that level of structural work. 2 more individual buyers came and went over the following weeks. James started describing the property as unique and requiring special consideration from the right buyer in his listings. I appreciated his discretion, though I suspected he thought Maurice had been dealing with foundation problems or environmental contamination, rather than anything supernatural. The development company contacted James directly in late November. Millbrook Properties LLC specialized in buying rural land for residential subdivisions, and they'd been tracking available lots in the area for future expansion. They weren't interested in preserving the existing house, just acquiring the land for eventual development. The offer came in 30% below the property's assessed value, but it included a clause accepting all existing documentation and waiving inspection rights. I accepted immediately. The closing took place at a law office in Millbrook, with me driving down from the city for the first time since I'd left. I brought Maurice's letter in a sealed envelope along with copies of his geological surveys and research notes. The development company's representative was a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen, who signed documents efficiently without reading the fine print. When I handed her the envelope containing Maurice's warnings, she thanked me and filed it with the other paperwork without opening it. I walked out of that office with a cashier's check and no legal obligation to ever think about Oak Ridge Road again. The Honda started on the first try, and I drove back to the city feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Whatever happened next wasn't my responsibility anymore. Sarah Chen never called to ask about the letter. James Morrison sent a brief email confirming the transaction was complete and wishing me well in my new living situation. I never learned whether the development company read Maurice's warnings or simply filed them away with other inherited documents they considered irrelevant to their plans. Sometimes I wondered if they'd started construction yet, if bulldozers had rolled up that gravel driveway to level the White House with green shutters. I imagined workers finding the basement hole and trying to explain it to their supervisors, or maybe the entity had made the opening disappear again, leaving only solid concrete for them to build over. Either way, it wasn't my problem to solve. The dreams started about a month after the sale. They came irregularly at first, maybe once a week when I was particularly tired or stressed. I'd be lying in my apartment bedroom surrounded by the familiar sounds of city traffic and neighboring televisions when I'd hear them. Faint at first, like voices from another room, then growing clearer until I could make out individual words. Dakota, please help us. Don't leave us here alone. I'd wake up with my heart racing, checking the time on my phone and listening to the normal sounds of urban nightlife. Cars passing on the street below, someone walking past in the hallway, the building's heating system cycling on and off. Real sounds from real sources, not supernatural entities calling from impossible spaces. The dreams never lasted long, and they never included the scratching sounds or multiple languages I'd heard at the house. Just the core voices I remembered most clearly, calling my name with that same desperate familiarity. I told myself they were normal stress dreams, my brain processing the trauma of those few days in a house where reality hadn't worked according to normal rules. But I knew better. I knew those voices were still real, still calling from beneath Morris's basement, even if the house itself was gone. The entity had collected them from people who'd made the same mistake I'd almost made. And now they were part of something larger that existed outside normal space and time. The dreams were just echoes, fragments of that experience following me to the city like shadows that couldn't quite reach their target. I learned to live with them. When the voices came in my sleep, I'd focus on the sounds of traffic and neighbors until they faded back into whatever realm they actually occupied. I'd remind myself that I was safe in a fourth-floor apartment with concrete walls and normal basement storage areas that contained nothing more dangerous than holiday decorations and exercise equipment. The knowledge stayed with me, though. Every time I walked past a basement door or heard unexplained sounds in old buildings, I remembered what I'd learned about the things that could hide beneath ordinary surfaces. I understood now why Maurice had lived alone for 20 years. Keeping his terrible secret locked away and never sharing the burden with anyone else. The padlock hadn't been meant to keep people out. It had been meant to keep something else in. Maurice had spent 2 decades trying to contain something that couldn't really be contained, just temporarily restrained and hidden from people who might make the same mistakes he'd made. The industrial-grade security, the warnings in his will, the isolation from friends and family, all of it had been his way of protecting others from knowledge that would have destroyed their sense of how the world worked. I carried that same knowledge now, the understanding that reality had thin places where older things could reach through and touch the present. I'd come closer than I wanted to admit to disappearing forever into that impossible hole, becoming another voice in the collection that called out to future visitors. Only Maurice's letter and my own last-minute decision to trust his warnings had saved me from that fate. Sometimes I wondered about the development company, whether they'd found anything unusual during construction or if the entity had simply moved deeper underground to wait for better opportunities. I never researched their progress or drove past the property to see what they'd built there. Some knowledge wasn't worth having, and some places were better left forgotten. But I knew the truth about what had been waiting beneath Maurice's house. Somewhere, in a space that existed outside normal geography, those voices were still calling out in the darkness, still waiting for the next person curious enough to listen and foolish enough to answer their pleas for help.